Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about dependent clauses still, but we're going to learn about a new type of dependent clause. And this type doesn't begin with an awoobus word. Okay, so it's still a clause, it has a subject and verb, and it still is dependent, so it can't stand alone as a sentence, but it's not going to begin with one of those subordinating conjunctions. Okay, so let's talk about that. So I'm in our resources section. I'm going to my grammar textbook, same as always. And in my grammar textbook, I'm going to go down to my sentence structure, okay, and open up my clauses beginning with relative pronouns, which is what these clauses will start with. So, like I said, there's a second kind of dependent clause, those beginning with relative pronouns. The relative pronoun acts as the subject of the clause and stops the clause from standing alone. Now, you may be saying, I've never heard of relative pronouns. I don't know what that means. I know what a pronoun is, not a relative pronoun. So let's go and learn about relative pronouns. All right, so relative pronouns, just like personal pronouns, which are the pronouns you're familiar with. I, me, my, he, she, it, they, you, your, all of those. Relative pronouns take the place of a noun just like those regular pronouns do. However, relative pronouns are used to begin a relative clause, which is a special type of dependent clause that describes a noun. Okay? Now, the relative pronouns are which, that, whose, whoever, whomever, who, and whom. In some cases, the words what, when, and where can also act like relative pronouns. Those are usually our question words, but sometimes we use them like they're a relative pronoun. So you'll also see that sometimes. So let's look at some examples. The cyclist who won the race trained hard. So who is my relative pronoun, and it's taking the place of the cyclist. So it's referring back to the cyclist. Okay. Next one, that. That is referring back to the pants. Same thing, it's taking the place of the pants later on in the sentence, referring back to it. Whoever in the next one is referring to the 4 team leaders, okay, and taking the place of that. And then in my next one, which, okay, is taking the place of spaghetti. Right? So those are my relative pronouns, and the most common ones you'll see are usually who, which, and that. Okay, so those are the main ones you need to keep an eye out for. So how does this relate to my dependent clauses? All right, let's go back to that clauses beginning with relative pronouns and talk about that. So the relative pronoun here is going to act as the subject of the clause and stop the clause from standing alone. Okay, so let's look at some examples. I took the highway that was finished just last month. My relative pronoun clause, my dependent clause, is that was finished just last month. Okay, so here, that is acting as the subject of the clause. Okay, it's referring back to highway. It's taking the place of highway. Okay, so it does two things. It acts as the subject, and it makes it so the clause can't stand alone. Because if I just say that was finished just last month, that doesn't make sense as a standalone sentence. That doesn't work, okay? All right, so let's look at my next example. The girl who was standing by the window is gone. Here, who is standing by the window is my dependent clause. Begins with the relative pronoun who, okay? Refers back to the girl, so it's describing the girl, okay? And can't stand alone. If I just say who was standing by the window, that doesn't, unless it's a question, that really can't stand alone as its own statement. All right. Now, note that these types of dependent clauses frequently interrupt an independent clause. Okay. So some examples. The highway that was finished last month goes to Indianapolis. My dependent clause here is that was finished last month, and it interrupts the independent clause. The highway goes to Indianapolis. Okay. Next one, same thing. The book, which is on the shelf, is excellent. Which is on the shelf is my dependent clause, and it is interrupting the independent clause. The book is excellent. Okay. It's also important to note that the word that is a very common word, and it's not always going to be beginning a dependent clause. Kind of like how we see, you know, because and if all the time, even when they're not with a dependent clause. That's been tripping you guys up a lot. Same thing with the word that. Okay. It doesn't always introduce dependent clause. Sometimes it's just a regular pronoun. For example, that is my book. Or an adjective. I like that book. So you'll see it in places that are dependent clauses, so be a little bit careful with that one. All right. So we're going to talk more about these types of clauses when we learn about how to punctuate them because that's kind of tricky. But for now, we're just going to focus on, when we look for dependent clauses, we're also going to look for these now. So we're not just looking for our WUBIS words, we're also looking for those relative pronouns.